Hello and welcome everyone to this second data dive webinar, Finding the Missing Link in Making Schools Inclusive for Children with Disabilities. My name is Jennifer Pai and I'm the coordinator of this webinar. I work at the International Institute for Educational Planning in Paris as an inclusive education specialist. This webinar is part of the currently ongoing technical roundtable on disability inclusive education sector planning for Francophone countries in Sub-Saharan Africa that IIEP is jointly organizing with UNICEF, both online and in Paris. 8 countries from Sub-Saharan Africa have been invited to discuss the challenges and good practices related to disability inclusive education sector planning. The event also serves to provide feedback on individual and institutional training needs of ministries of education. And I'm happy to say that the information will feed into the development of a training offer related to disability inclusive education sector planning that both UNICEF and IIEP are collaborating on. I'm particularly happy to welcome our Francophone participants who I am sure are listening to the French translation that is being provided on a different channel as I speak. And additionally, I would also like to send a warm greeting to our participants from last year's technical roundtable who are joining us as well. As we are introducing a live interpretation system, I would please ask you to all bear with us in case we experience any technical issues. I hope we won't. Now, let me briefly address the format of this webinar. The webinar will last for about 1 hour. Our speaker will present first for about 25 minutes, and then the floor will be open for your questions. We will collect your questions throughout the webinar and we will try to address as many of them as possible. Please note that our roundtable participants have already put forth some questions that our presenter will address first. The chat window on YouTube will be open throughout the event. You will need a Gmail account to present yourself or ask questions on the YouTube platform. Alternatively, you can also join us on the hashtag Plan for Inclusion and ask your questions there. Now, let me present the speaker. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce for the second time Dr. Daniel Mont, who is connecting from Washington, D.C. in the US today. Daniel is a global expert in the area of disability data collection and education management information systems. He's co-founder and president of the Center for Inclusive Policy in Washington, D.C., and the lead consultant in developing indicators for monitoring the implementation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. He has vast experience in the assessment of disability data as part of education data collection systems, especially education management information systems. Today, his presentation is entitled Building an Education Management Information System to Support Inclusion. Without further ado, I hand over to Daniel in Washington, D.C. Hello, Daniel.
Hello, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone, whatever time zone you're in today. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'll share my screen now so we can start with the presentation. Okay, I just want to check and make sure that is everything okay? Can you see the screen fine?
I can see the screen, yes.
Great. Okay, so today's presentation is on building an education management information system to support inclusion. And just to review, I know some of you are very familiar with what an EMIS is, but for some of you it may be new. Basically, an EMIS is just the administrative data system for collecting information from schools. And it's collected routinely as part of the school system in order to manage the school education services, in order to evaluate how well the education services are doing. And they collect a variety of data on child characteristics, whether boys or girls, or what class, what grade level the children are in, and education outcomes, whether the children are dropping out of school, whether they're being promoted, what their grades and learning outcomes might be. Collects information on school facilities and materials, and also on human resources. So it collects information on the children and on the schools. So why do we collect this data? What is an EMIS used for? For three things, basically. First, for tracking children's outcomes. How are the children doing in the school? Who are they? What are their characteristics? And what are their outcomes? Second, for monitoring school quality, the physical plant and materials, but also the human resources, with the teaching staff and the support staff, and the accessibility of the school, especially if we're talking about inclusion and making sure that the school is inclusive of all children, including those with disabilities. And finally, to evaluate the impact of changes in school quality, curriculum, or other interventions, right? Because if you're collecting information routinely as part of an administrative data system, and you do some sort of intervention, you train the teachers, you reduce the class size, you introduce new textbooks, whatever it is you're doing to try to improve the school, since you have a baseline from the administrative data system, you can then see what has changed with the intervention and has it been effective in improving school outcomes. There are basically two types of EMISs. There's a paper EMIS, usually done one time a year. In most countries that use a paper EMIS, it's done at the beginning of the term. And the data is often collected at the classroom or school level. Individual students are not tracked. In other words, a paper form gets sent to every school. The school teacher or the school administrator says, okay, in this class we have 47 students, 23 of them are girls, 3 of them are children with disabilities, and information is tracked at that classroom level. An electronic EMIS, though, sometimes referred to as a granular one, when it can track individual students, keeps information on each particular student, what his or her characteristics are and what his or her outcomes are. And because it's electronic, it can be updated throughout the year. It doesn't have to be just collected at one time. And it could be aggregated to the classroom or the school level, right? Because you have information on every child, you can aggregate it to see what's going on at a classroom level, what's going on at a school level, what's going on at the district level. But it does require every school to have access to a computer. So it requires a certain level of resources in order to be able to have an electronic system. So the first question is, in an EMIS, why would we want to identify children with disabilities? Okay, when we're collecting information on each child, why do we want to know? And there are basically 2 reasons for this. The first is to help us design and deliver better educational services to improve their learning. Children with disabilities might have different needs. They might require different supports. And therefore, if we want to be able to make sure that their learning outcomes are equivalent to other students, we want to be able to identify those needs and we want to be able to address them. A second reason for collecting information is to monitor the outcomes of children with disabilities to see if the school system is meeting all children's needs. Okay? In aggregate, are children with disabilities getting promoted to the next grade at the same rate? Are they dropping out of school at a higher rate? Are they entering school at later ages? So we can get an idea of how inclusive the outcomes are at a system level. Okay, so there's 2 levels. At the student level, to try to address their needs, to focus on what the teacher should be doing in the classroom in order to help that student. And the second is at the aggregate level in order to get a bird's eye view of what's happening in the education system. The next question, and this is a very commonly asked question, is it important to label the child as having a disability? Sometimes people get very concerned about that because of the stigma that's associated with disability in many places. And does labeling a child Does it create that stigma? Does it reinforce that stigma? And are there some disadvantages to that? Well, for delivering services, if we had a truly inclusive, truly fully inclusive education system, we wouldn't need to label a child as having a disability, okay? Because what we would be doing for all children is trying to collect information on the difficulties they are having in the classroom and thinking about how we can modify our teaching techniques, how we can modify our classroom structure, how we could do things differently to make sure that all children's needs are being met. And that's how we would be dealing with all children. And there would be no reason to say this child has a disability, this child doesn't have a disability. However, in reality, in most school systems, we do have to identify the child as having a disability because money often follows the label. In many school systems, it's a child having a disability will trigger more resources to that child or will trigger more resources to that child's teacher. And therefore, for those kinds of institutional reasons, it is important to identify a child as having a disability. For monitoring outcomes, however, we definitely have to identify which children have a disability or which children don't have a disability if we're going to be able to look and see, are children with disabilities having equal outcomes to children without disabilities? In order to make that statement, in order to make that comparison, we have to be able to say these are the children with disabilities and these are the children without disabilities. However, there's no reason why in that instance the child would even have to know that they have been considered or labeled as having a disability, or the parent wouldn't even have to know. It's part of the administrative system. As a matter of fact, even the teacher wouldn't have to know this child has a disability. Basically, the information that could be collected is these are the children who are having difficulties doing various things that might affect their ability to learn. And that information can be recorded and as I'll talk about later in the presentation, and used in the classroom without the child receiving a label, even though at the administrative data level, when we're generating the reports, we can identify this set of children as having a disability and this set is not having a disability in order to generate those reports. So then the question is, how can we identify children with disabilities? Well, a lot of work has been done in the last 15 years on trying to come up with good quality, internationally comparable ways of identifying people with disabilities. And this has been done to a large extent by the Washington Group on Disability Statistics. The Washington Group was established by the UN Statistical Commission to improve disability measurement in censuses and surveys. And it consists of representatives from national statistical offices of UN member states. So dozens and dozens of country representatives have participated in the Washington Group on Disability Statistics. And it also has been done in cooperation with many UN and bilateral aid agencies. DPOs and NGOs have participated. If you want to learn more about the Washington Group on Disability Statistics, you can see the link here that's on this slide, and you can there's a lot of information. One of the things the Washington Group has done in conjunction with UNICEF is create the Child Functioning Module. Child Functioning Module is a set of survey questions based on a biopsychosocial model of disability to identify children with disabilities. It does not ask about disability. Nowhere in the functioning module does it say, does your child have a disability? Because for various reasons, that's a bad way of going about identifying people. One, because of stigma. People don't like to say they have a disability. And for other reasons as well that I don't have time to really go into. It's much better when trying to identify people or children in this instance with disabilities by asking them, what difficulties do you have doing basic activities that put you at risk, that put the person at risk of exclusion if they face environmental barriers? This question set, the Child Functioning Module, has been tested and adopted in many countries. It's been recommended by many international agencies, and it's included in the latest round of UNICEF's Multiple Indicator Cluster Survey, or MICS. So we're going to have a lot of information very soon about children with disabilities around the world. One EMIS that uses the child functioning module is in Fiji. And so what Fiji asks each teacher to do is to judge whether the child has difficulty in the following functional areas: seeing, hearing, gross and fine motor. Gross motor is things like walking and climbing steps. Fine motor is things like writing or manipulating small objects, things like that. Learning, both general and specific. General learning is general cognitive difficulties and learning all types of things. Specific refers to things like that are associated with things like dyslexia, okay, where a child's sort of cognitive abilities are strong, except in one area, a very specific area, for example, like dyslexia. Behavior, attention, socialization, and emotional as well, because we want to get at psychosocial difficulties, because they also can affect children's ability to learn. And again, the focus is on difficulties related to the ability to learn in school compared to children of the same age. And children who have these difficulties are considered to have a disability. So let me give you an example from the FEMIS student forum. This is the question on seeing. So the teacher is asked to compare this child with children of the same age. Compared with children of the same age, does the child have difficulty in the following areas? Seeing, does the child have difficulty seeing things close up or far away, like objects, faces, or pictures? If the child wears glasses, does the child have difficulty seeing even when wearing the glasses? And then the teacher's asked to say the child has no difficulty, a little difficulty, a lot of difficulty, cannot do it all. And if the teacher wants to elaborate, to explain, the teacher can provide a short description on the nature of that difficulty. Notice nowhere in this question is the word disability mentioned. Nowhere in the question is the child is labeled as a child having a disability. What's labeled is the level of difficulty that the teacher can use in his or her planning. And then as I said before, at the aggregate level, at the statistical level, for generating reports, for evaluating reports, in the analysis, you can say, okay, children with a lot of difficulty or cannot do it all, we're going to say they have a disability for the purpose of generating a report, for the purpose of monitoring how children are doing, but the child, his or herself, doesn't necessarily even ever need to have that label. And then here are the remaining questions in the FEMIS. As you can see, hearing, difficulty hearing sounds like people's voices or music, and then all the other areas I was talking about before. In emotions, at the bottom there, it says, how often does the child seem very sad or depressed or worried and anxious? And instead of saying the child has no difficulty, a little difficulty, a lot of difficulty, cannot do, the categories are the child has feels sad or depressed rarely, weekly, monthly, or daily. And so again, and that gives a range of intensity of the difficulty without ever saying the child has a mental health problem or it has a disability. That never appears in the form. Okay? So the teachers in the FEMIS, in the Fiji EMIS, receive a guidebook on how to categorize children, how to determine how they're going to say what level of difficulty is. And it's not a survey. So in a survey, when we're going from house to house and asking a question, the respondent only hears that question one time. Here, the teacher is filling it out, the form for every child. Every teacher in the school is doing it. They receive some training. They talk to each other. So they gain experience, and it really improves the quality of information that's being collected. And in fact, in Fiji, they tested the teachers' responses against the parents' responses, and they had an independent clinical assessment. And they found that the teachers had a very high level of agreement with what the parents and the clinical assessment said. So in the field, we have evidence that teachers can reliably fill out these forms. Of course, the bigger the class. In Fiji, I believe the class sizes are only around 30 students or so. In a country where the class sizes are 80 students, of course, it would be more difficult. But in FEMIS, the teacher and the parent review the forms together and come to an agreement on how they feel the level of difficulty the child is experiencing in each of those areas. And then in this FEMIS, once the child has considered to have a certain level of difficulty, they then get referred to services. So if a child has difficulty, say a lot of difficulty seeing, the teacher in the FEMIS form is listed the types of services that the child can then be referred to: a school health team, the district hospital, and the Pacific Eye Institute. There's something called Project Heaven there. I'm not sure what that is. An optometrist. And it's a list of potential services, and the teacher can say, okay, given this child's level of difficulty, this is the level of service that the child might need in order to be able to overcome that level of difficulty. So that level of difficulty in seeing doesn't get in the way of the child's learning. And there's, on the slide, you can see there's lists of different services associated for each particular type of difficulty. Okay, so that gives us a lot of information about the FEMIS difficulties that kids are having and what services they might need. But in order to have a truly inclusive EMIS, we need information not just on the child, we need information on the environment, right? Because inclusion is really about the environment. A child has difficulty learning, a child with difficulties seeing, hearing, walking, learning, etc., faces barriers to learning. And it's those barriers which really create disability, okay? So what we want to know, what is the level of physical accessibility in the school? What's the informational accessibility? We're talking about children, let's say, who have severe vision difficulties, or children who cannot hear, who face barriers to getting information. Facilities and materials, staffing and staff training. You know, what's the environment? What's the school environment? What are the barriers and facilitators in the school that either help or hinder children's learning? So where do we get these questions? UNICEF has a guide. UNICEF guide has a set of minimum questions and examples of additional questions, and I'll show you some in a minute. There's a forthcoming EMIS guide that UNESCO is putting together, which will have a recommended set of questions for the EMIS on the physical environment. And that unfortunately is not published yet, but it should be out this fall. And the FEMIS has an extended list of questions, a very detailed set of questions that capture many, many aspects of the environment which you can look at. But sometimes people see this as overwhelming. Oh, this is going to be a very big burden on our schools to answer all these questions about the environment. You're asking too much of us, they'll say. But there are ways to move in steps. And a current EMIS, most current EMISs already collect information about the environment. They already collect information about facilities, materials, and the staff. So there are ways to adapt the current information that's being asked to collect better information on accessibility and inclusion. And I'll give you some examples of that. In the UNICEF guide, the minimum set of questions on access are: is the road leading to school is the road leading to the school accessible to a student in a wheelchair, including during the rainy season? Yes or no? Are there steps leading up to the main entrance? If yes, is there a proper ramp in good condition, usable by a person in a wheelchair? Is the main entrance to the school wide enough for a person in a wheelchair to enter? This is really minimal, but it is sort of the basic question: can the child get into the school? And then also very important, especially in low-income countries, a big barrier to children with disabilities attending school are accessible toilets. So the minimum questions on toilets for an inclusive EMIS, according to the UNICEF guide, are how many toilet compartments are there in the school for children, functional, not functional, for boys, for girls, but then they ask, Are the toilets accessible to children with physical disabilities? And then do the teachers have their own toilet facilities? And are the teachers' facilities accessible to a person with a physical disability? Because we don't want the school just to be accessible to students with disabilities. We want the school to be accessible to teachers with disabilities as well. Okay. Now, most EMISs already collect information on facilities, as I was saying. This is an example from ICID 4 UNESCO data. You can see it already asks, does the school have electricity? Does it have computers? Does it have improved toilets, water sources, and things like that. So one option, if you don't want to, if a country doesn't want to go the route of creating a long list of questions to fully describe the accessibility of the school, is just to add things to existing forms to make them collect information which addresses accessibility. So in this case here, the yellow lines are things that are added to the previous form. So we ask in the previous form, the country is already asking, does the school have internet for pedagogical purposes? You can add the question with screen readers for students with visual impairment. So if you're already asking about the internet, you add a question to see if that internet is accessible to children who can't see, and the like. I can't go through it all, or I'll use up all of my time here. Another thing you can do is simply add a column to talk about accessibility. Here's an example from India. These are questions that the India EMIS is already asking. Is there a separate room for the assistant head, master, vice principal? Is there an auditorium? Is there an ICT lab? Is there a room for indoor games, et cetera, et cetera? And in this case, if you just add a column, they're already asking about availability. You add the column, is it accessible to students with disabilities? Yes or no. What does accessibility mean? How do we measure accessibility? We can talk more about that. But this is a way of just adding some information to an existing form. Doesn't really increase the length of the form very much at all. And it starts to address potential barriers, finding barriers in the environment that are getting in the ways of student learning. The UNICEF minimum question on human resources. In the past year, how many teachers received in-service training on teaching children with disabilities? Because in-service training is very important, not just pre-service. You can't have one course and then know how to do inclusion. And then ask, are there specialists for teaching children with disabilities in your school? Yes or no, and if yes, how many? If you look at the FEMIS guide, which we don't have time to do, it asks questions like, does the school have access to a physical therapist? Does it have access to a speech therapist? Does it have access to a special education teacher? And then how available is this person available on a daily basis, weekly, monthly, et cetera? So there's a lot more information that goes beyond these minimum questions. One example of an EMIS that's available to you that goes into collecting this kind of information has been put together by UNESCO. Open EMIS is an open source electronic granular system that's created by UNESCO that can be adapted by country. So a country could, if you have an electronic EMIS, you can download this system and you can modify it, tweak it to adapt it to your local context. It collects information not just on children's disabilities, but the services they need in the school environment. And there can be reasons for adapting. For example, one reason in East Africa, they felt it was important to add to the form a question about albinism, because there's so much discrimination associated with albinism that it was important to track what was going on with those children. Now being used in over at least 20 countries, so this open EMIS is growing, and there's a lot of examples of countries that are trying to collect this information. So going back to the FEMIS, which I think is really best practice out there right now. The school environment form, as I said, contains information on the school environment and which services are available. When a parent comes into the school for a parent-teacher conference, in order to establish the child's individual education plan, they sit down together. The children's needs are compared to what's available in the school, and then the child gets referred to the services and accommodations. If those services and accommodations are not available, the cost of providing them are linked to the school's budget document. So the FEMIS can generate, oh, this is how many children have difficulty doing these activities. These are the services they need. These are the services they're getting. The services they're not getting, this is how much it would cost to actually provide that. Okay, so, and that's what I was just saying before. So this gives us a wide bunch of information for every purpose. It collects information that helps the teacher deliver better services. It collects information that helps the school plan for what resources are needed, and it helps the Ministry of Education as a whole able to track all the schools, all the school districts, to see how well they're performing in aggregate when it comes to children with disabilities. So that sums up very quickly, gives you an overview of what an inclusive EMIS can look like and what it could give you. We could talk about it for a much longer period of time. I hope in the now we have opportunity for questions and answers, that anything which wasn't clear to you, we can go into in more detail. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. That's been very interesting to get a closer look at what an education management information system can actually look like. We've been talking more about theoretical approaches, so actually see it in action, I think, is quite useful to our listeners, I hope. So the next part of the webinar is basically addressing questions from our participants, both of the technical roundtable, but also more broadly. I believe there are quite a number of questions that came in through YouTube and our social media. So let me just start by putting a few questions to you, Dan. I believe some of them you've already covered in the presentation, but I would like to put some of them out there. So let me start with the first one from actually UNICEF Togo. This is Delali Akpalo, and the person is asking, can countries have their own standardized methodology regarding data collection? So an interesting question. Can countries have their own standardized methodology regarding data collection? Over to you, Dan.
Well, I think in different countries, you have to adapt the data that's being collected to the local context. As I was saying, in East Africa, it's very important to collect information on albinism. It's not important in other countries. To collect information on whether a school has screen readers doesn't make sense in a school that doesn't have in a country where the schools don't have computers. So yes, and that's why the Open EMIS is designed in a way where countries can adapt it to their context. But the general approach, how do we identify children, that I think should be uniform everywhere. You're identifying children by the level of difficulty they have doing these basic activities. And the general approach that we need to collect information on all aspects of the environment, physical, informational, human resources, that I think really is standard across all countries, but adapting to the local context for sure.
Great, thank you very much, Dan. The next question comes from Ndeye Gweye. Section des Femmes is the National Association for Physical Disabilities of Senegal. And she's asking, do you think that taking into account disability in the national census of our populations can help to solve the data issue in our African countries?
Well, the answer to that is yes and no. I think it is important when you do a census and you collect information on people with disabilities. You find not only generally how many there are, but whether there are geographical patterns. In some countries I've looked at, the rates of disability can vary very significantly from one area to another area. They can vary by gender, by age group, and it's important. But when we're talking about children, there we have, I think the census falls short, because the census questions, the Washington Group census questions, first of all, it can't be used for children under age 5. And for children between 5 and 17, we know they undercount the number of children who have developmental disabilities. And that's why UNICEF and the Washington group created a child functioning module, because to provide information that the Washington group census questions were not good at collecting. And that's why I think the MIX, the multiple indicator cluster survey, is so important, because that is a large household survey that contains the child functioning module that will collect information on children in and out of school. And so for children, I think the household survey, a MIX, is actually more important. But in general, for general issues about disability, especially among adults, I think it is critical that censuses have questions on disability.
Okay, great, thanks. Dan, would you mind closing your presentation so we can see you?
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. Sure. So I have quite a few questions that came from our participants on the issue of stigma. So I'm going to summarize them. I have one from Burkina Faso, from Donatien Ouedraogo, who's working for the Network for the Promotion of Inclusive Education. I have the question on stigma from the World Bank staff in the Burkina Faso office, Boubacar Lompo, and also from Togo, from the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education, Meheza Balikpante. They're all wondering, how do you manage the collection of data while avoiding the stigma that can be a real barrier to the identification and education of children with disabilities? And I know you've addressed it already a little bit, but I think could you perhaps elaborate a little bit more on this?
Sure. Well, first, I want to acknowledge that stigma is a very big problem, especially in some countries. And that's one reason why, if you look at the EMIS form and you look at the Washington group questions, the word disability is never used. And that is for a couple reasons, but the main reason is to try to reduce the stigma. Asking whether a child has a learning disability creates more stigma, and makes people more reticent to admit that there's an issue than asking if the child is having difficulties doing something. And we, in the testing, we find that it doesn't completely eliminate it, but it definitely reduces a stigma. And I think it all boils down to how the teachers are trained and how the school is set up, and the awareness raising to try to lessen that. And if the school is really inclusive, as I was saying before, there's no reason to say this child has a disability. The child doesn't have to know that they have been given a label of a disability if we have an inclusive setting. So we have to try to move in that direction. It's hard to do when the child gets the label, they get money, they get extra resources. If that's a precondition, then and it's harder to move away from the label. But I think it's an issue that goes beyond data collection. And in the data collection, we just try not to use the word. We try to focus on, we're collecting information about difficulties children are having and how we might try to address them.
Okay, thank you, Dan. Here I have another question actually from Meheza Balikpante from the Ministry of Primary and Secondary Education in Togo. It's a broader one, but I thought I'll put it to you. He would like to know how to use data from multiple sources for IE planning.
Well, this is where having a common approach really helps. So for example, in Fiji, they're about to do the mix. And when they do the mix, they're going to be using the child functioning module. And because their EMIS is based on the mix, on the child functioning module questions, it'll be very easy for them to coordinate, compare the data from the EMIS and the data from the household surveys, so that they know when they're looking at types of children, the children who are out of school and the children who are in school, they're using the same rubric, they're using the same methodology to try to identify which children are at risk, and so it's easier to use that together. One problem countries often have is the Ministry of Education, the National Statistical Office, the Ministry of Social Protection, all use different definitions or different approaches to collecting information on disability. So you have one ministry saying that 1% of the population has a disability. You have another ministry saying that 15% of the population has a disability. And people get very confused, and they think, and they don't know what's going on, and they don't know how to leverage or coordinate that data together. So yes, I think it's important to have all sources of information. And EMIS only tells you what's going on in school. Doesn't tell you anything about the children who are totally excluded from the school system. If we want to reach them, we have to have information about them. So I think a mix and an EMIS that's based on the CFM can be used in conjunction together in a much more effective way.
Okay, great. Thanks, Dan. Now I'm turning to situations of emergency. I have an interesting question here from Catherine Hogego from DFID, the UK. She's asking, what kind of data should we collect in conflict and emergency situations? Should the child functioning module be used, or is there a more appropriate tool? And she's saying that DFID has tried to ask programs to collect disaggregated data on disability, but most do not. So are there steps you can take to collect data on people with disabilities that we should consider? For example, should we collect different data in the initial emergency response versus the long-term intervention?
Yeah, this is a great question. And luckily, there's a new tool that talks exactly about this. Humanity and Inclusion recently developed a tool and an online training on collecting data on disability in humanitarian and emergency situations. And there are some particular issues that arise in humanitarian settings, and I think the best answer for that is to go to this particular tool. There's a set of webinars, and there's some documents, and we did some research in testing it out in Democratic Republic of Congo, Jordan, Philippines, and I think there was one more country. I'm blanking on it. But instead of trying off the top of my head to remember the key points, I think what we should do is send out to anyone who wants to know the link to this tool. Okay, great, thank you. And here I'm going to put to you a question from our colleagues at UNICEF Burkina Faso, from Félicité Savadogo. She's wondering whether there's still unresolved methodological issues for collecting reliable data in inclusive education. Yeah, I mean, we never get to perfection, so there's always issues. But I think we've made a lot of progress. I think we have much more accurate ways of collecting information on children who have disabilities, who have difficulties, and I think we have a better understanding of the environmental factors that can create barriers that we need to overcome in order to have inclusive education. So I think these examples, and FEMIS is one of the best examples out there I've seen. If we go over with a fine-tooth comb, you're always going to be able to find issues, and if you have particular concerns, ask about them, and we can talk about that particular. But I think we're in good shape. I think we're in much better shape now than we were 10 years ago in terms of collecting this information. Great. Now here's a question that's not really directed to you, Dan, but I still thought I'll put it out there, see what your opinion is. Basically, we have the Fédération Togolaise des Associations de Personnes Handicapées, so the Federation of People with Disabilities of Togo. It's Mr. Marc Annalene. He's wondering, is it not time that UNESCO and UNICEF oblige the states to provide annual statistics which include learners with disabilities through tools and surveys that are internationally recognized? What's your thinking on this? Yes, and that's what that report that's coming out in this fall that UNESCO put together. It's organized around the SDG indicators, SDG 4 on education, but it is recommendations on how the data reported to UNESCO can be changed in order to meet the goal of being able to disaggregate data on disability, and also SDG 4.8.1, I think it is, which talks about inclusive schools. So they are. I don't want to speak for UNESCO completely here, but I know they are taking action on that, and that's what this report that's coming out in the fall, I believe, is hoping to address. And I just, Jennifer, I just sent you the link to the Humanity Inclusion Toolkit on humanitarian aid and disability. So I don't know if you can send that out, put that on the screen now for the person who asked that question. I don't know.
Okay, great. Perfect. Now let me turn to questions that we've been receiving through our YouTube channels. And in particular here, I have a question from Novia Angraeni. Can EMIS reports be used as suggestions to modify the curriculum at national level?
Well, I mean, it can do two things. One, it can provide information about the types of difficulties that children are having, right? So if you and that information could be useful for people designing the curriculum. It can make them more aware that the curriculum has to be designed in a way to meet those children's needs, and also it can be used to see what happens when the curriculum is changed, whether that makes a difference in these students' outcomes. But in terms of figuring out, what that curriculum should be, no, I think that I don't think that's really that's really what EMIS is used for.
And now I guess this is a question that that you've, in a way, I mean, obviously you've answered, but I still put it out there. Is there a disability minimum standard guide with outcomes which can be adopted for a new project? And that question comes from Edgar Fungo.
Disability standards?
A guide with outputs and outcomes.
I think the person is asking about accessibility standards, not disability. I think that's what I'm going to assume that's what the question is asking about. Are there standards for what constitutes an accessible school, what constitutes an inclusive curriculum, and things like that? Yeah, there are out there different standards for what that means. I don't think that they're universally accepted everywhere. They tend to address the same kinds of things, but there are tools out there, indicator sets that are used to assess whether a school is accessible. And I think it's important for a country to have those, because then they can ask in an EMIS, for example, whether the school meets those accessibility standards, and if they do meet them, then you have a clearer idea of what the school is like, rather than just asking, as I suggested in that India example, is it accessible, yes or no? And are people going to answer that the same way? Probably not. So it is good to have those standards, and there are examples of what those standards are. But I do think those standards too probably need to be adapted to a local country context, because environments and resource levels are different in different places. So I don't think there's one set of standards that's going to apply to every country in the world, but there are examples of what those standards look like that you can look at.
Great, thanks, Dan. Another question from our YouTube channel comes from Sabine Weber. She says, I have the impression that in general, bigger countries are having more issues with inclusive education than smaller countries. Would you agree to that? And if yes, do you have an explanation?
Well, it all depends on how much effort they're putting into it. I think every place should have an emphasis on inclusive education. And how that plays out is different in different countries, again, because of the level of resources and because of the capacities within those places. But whether you're talking about a low-income country with very few resources, or you're talking about a high-income country with a lot of resources, at every level there are things you can do to make schools more inclusive. And, you know, different environments in different countries may be able to do more or less. But I think that there are practical things you could do in every context.
Perfect. I have a question from Mary Otieno, and this is surely a question that a lot of people are asking. Facilities and equipment and training, everything is so expensive. What can we do to develop interest on managing disability in the school environment or even at home?
Right. Well, that's why I said we have to. Of course, every country has to think about the resources it has. But in a World Bank publication notes that building an accessible school costs maybe 1% more than building an inaccessible school. So retrofitting a school can be very expensive. Going into a school that's not accessible and trying to make it accessible can be expensive. But when you're building a new school, it is not expensive to make it physically accessible. And so that's a no-brainer. That's an easy one. Any new school that's built should be built accessibly, and it won't add any significant cost. Yeah, and there's lots of expensive technology that can be used out there that is out of the budgets of some countries, but then there are simple things you can do as well. Some of them don't cost any money. Some of them are like noticing whether a child is having difficulty seeing and making sure she sits near the front of the class. It could be just sort of adapting the way that class is taught so that children can work each other and support with each other in the learning. That doesn't cost money. There are sometimes very simple modifications to furniture that could be done. So I think there's a wide range. I don't think the costs might affect, you know, which steps you take, the order you take them, and the rate you take them. But I don't think cost gets in the way of making things more inclusive. I think there are a lot of creative things out there you can do to move in that direction. And yeah.
Okay, thank you, Dan. And now a question from Senegal, from the Ministry of Education, from Malik Sanoko. Person is asking, when data is coming from various sources, who should be responsible for EMIS for children with disabilities?
Well, the EMIS is Administrative Data System, so it's reporting from the schools. In a lot of the countries that responded to the questionnaire that we sent out prior to this webinar, report that most of them are using paper censuses, and most of those paper censuses are being filled out by the school administrator. It's better for the teacher to be filling out information about the child, because it's the teacher who knows the individual children and has a much better sense of what kind of difficulties the child might have. So the information has to come from the schools because it's administrative data, and I think the teachers are the ones who are better placed. Now, getting the teachers to fill out information on every single child in a paper system, that's going to be almost impossible. That requires and work. Electronic systems better, but of course, you may not have access to computers in every school, so you have to think you have to come up with a plan step by step. How you can move towards the collecting more and better information about children and environments. So you can't make it a perfectly inclusive EMIS overnight, but there are steps you can take to move in that direction.
Thank you, Dan. And here another question from Kyla Funk. I'm not sure where the person's from. Is there any data regarding the teaching of sexual education to children with disabilities? This is something that children with disabilities are often excluded from and needs to be addressed somehow. It's kind of beyond our discussions, but I thought I'll put it out there.
Well, if an EMIS asks about that, then an EMIS should you keep track of whether that was done the same for children with and without disabilities. right? The idea behind the inclusive EMIS is that children with disabilities, any information that's collected is collected in a way where we can see if there's barriers to inclusion. So if EMISs don't collect that information now, maybe that's up to them whether they think it's important to collect it for all children. But if they do, if they are collecting it, they need to collect it in a way to disaggregate. I mean, one study we did in Cameroon showed that, for example, HIV infection rates were highest among people with disabilities, especially girls with mental disabilities have the highest rates of HIV infection, and they believe that was linked to sexual education and other factors. So I think I agree with whoever asked the question. It's a very important issue, and there's definitely a very strong disability component to sexual and reproductive education. And so if an EMIS, if that's going on in the schools, then and data is being collected about it, it's important that it be able to be disaggregated by disability.
Thank you, Dan. We're nearly running out of time, so let me put one more question to you. I'm paraphrasing the question slightly. It comes from Inyang Umoren. That person is asking whether there is special training that would be recommended for teachers to support data collection. I mean, we are talking a lot about the role of teachers in collecting data on children with disabilities. So what kind of training should teachers be receiving, and have you seen any good practices in this area?
Yeah, it doesn't need much training for the teacher to identify the difficulties the child is having. Might require a lot of training for teachers to develop the skills to be inclusive education teachers. You know, that's a different issue. But just for the collecting of data, it doesn't require very much. As a matter of fact, when in one country where this was tested in Africa, the teachers at first were very resistant to doing this. How can we do this? When they were actually asked to do it, they said afterwards that it wasn't anywhere as complicated as they thought it was going to be. They were envisioning having to diagnose if a child has autism or diagnose if a child has this or that. No, they're just asked to see whether a child has difficulty doing something in this area. And they actually reported that they found it really useful, that it raised their awareness, that the simple collection of the data, simply having to think about each child. Does this child have difficulty learning? Does this child have a general or a specific difficulty learning? Does this child have difficulty walking? Just having to think about that made them see things in their students that they hadn't saw before. And they reported that they felt that the simple collection of the data made them better teachers, which I thought was really interesting, which is similar to a non-education setting that was providing some health services in India, where again, the people providing the services were like, why are we collecting this data? And then after they collected the data, they reported the same thing. They had never really thought about what might be difficulties their clients were having doing things that were getting in the way of them receiving the services that they had a right to, that they deserved. And they felt that alone improved service delivery, even without additional interventions or training about how to provide inclusive services. So, and when we tested in the humanitarian inclusion setting too, in those refugee camps, when we did the same thing, testing the data there, it was we got the same response that they never thought to think about it, and just the simple act of collecting the data made them think about it, which made them adjust and do things they hadn't been doing before, even without any additional resources. It could be just because it changed their mindset about trying to reach people where they were at instead of providing something in a very uniform, robotic kind of way.
Okay, thank you so much, Dan. There have been a lot of questions thrown at you. It was great, very interesting. I think we're coming to the end now. I would just like to briefly say to the participants of the roundtable that is happening at the moment, that the webinar will be posted on the platform, and we'll make sure that you can access the presentation as well that Dan has just made in French. So that will be available. So let me thank Dan Mont for a great presentation. Thank you very much. And I would also like to thank everybody who's been listening in and interested in the questions of inclusive education for children with disabilities. IAP and UNESCO are committed in putting together a training program. So please stay posted on our training program that's coming up in 2020 on the Foundations course for Disability Inclusive Education Sector Planning. Thank you very much. Thanks again, Dan. Thank you.
Good day, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.